The desert wasn't made for mercy that night. The sky churned like a wounded beast, hurling needles of cold rain across the barren land, swallowing every familiar trail beneath sheets of darkness. Mara didn't know how long she had been riding, only that her fingers had gone numb around the reins, and her breath came out in harsh bursts that tasted of fear. She wasn't running from the weather. She was running from men whose laughter still echoed behind her ribs. Her horse stumbled, then steadied. Through the curtain of rain, she saw it, a faint square of orange light flickering like a promise in the endless dark. A cabin. A life. A chance. Mara urged her exhausted Mare forward, clutching the saddle horn as the wind snapped her wet hair against her face. She whispered a prayer she didn't believe in anymore. Please. Not another empty ruin. Not tonight. As she approached, the outline sharpened. A small lodge built from thick timber. Its porch bowed slightly under the weight of years. Smoke curled from the chimney, rising stubbornly into the storm. Someone lived here. Someone with fire. Someone who might open their door, or someone who might not. She slid from her horse, boots landing in mud that swallowed them almost to the ankle. The porch groaned under her steps. She raised her fist and knocked. For 3 long seconds, nothing happened. Only the storm answered, rattling the cabin like it wanted in. Then the door opened just enough for a sliver of firelight to escape. Man stood in the gap. She almost stepped back, not because he frightened her, but because he was so still, so silent, she wondered if he was flesh or shadow. His hair was tied back with rawhide, rain catching on the loose strands near his face. His chest was bare except for a woven necklace that looked older than the storm itself. His eyes were dark, unreadable, but not cold. This was an Apache warrior, a man carved from sorrow and solitude. She swallowed, breath shaking. Please, I need shelter. He didn't move, didn't speak. For a heartbeat, she thought he would send her back into the night, but then his gaze shifted slowly to her trembling hands, to the bruise forming on her cheek, to the way her clothes clung to her body like a second skin, soaked through. Something in him flickered. He stepped aside without a word. Warmth enveloped her the moment she crossed the threshold. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting gold over the room. She hadn't felt heat in hours, and the sudden contrast made her dizzy. The man closed the door behind her and secured it with a heavy wooden bar. Only then did he face her fully, the fire revealing the angles of his features, strong, watchful, marked by a loneliness so deep it felt like a desert canyon carved behind his eyes. Thank you, she whispered. His answer came in a low murmur, unused and rough as if he hadn't spoken in days. You are safe. She nodded, unable to hold his gaze for long. Her throat tightened. She smelled smoke, leather, pine resin, all of it grounding her in a way that made her knees weaken. He didn't crowd her, didn't question her. Instead, he moved with slow, deliberate steps toward a shelf, retrieving a thick folded blanket. When he offered it to her, their fingers brushed. A jolt ran through her, unexpected, unwelcome, and yet warm as sunrise. Sit, he said. Gesturing toward the fire, she obeyed, sinking to her knees near the hearth, letting the flames breathe life back into her bones. The blanket settled around her shoulders like a protective weight. She exhaled, trembling. Outside, thunder cracked open the sky. Inside, silence grew heavy, gentle, but taut with something unspoken. Finally, she lifted her head. I didn't mean to intrude. I just had nowhere else to go. His gaze lingered on her, careful, steady. Storm is too strong. You stay. Not an offer. A certainty. And somehow, after all she had survived, that certainty broke something tender inside her. For the first time in 2 years, she felt the faint, fragile pulse of safety. And she wondered who this lonely Apache was, and why fate had led her to his door tonight. After Mara arrived at the isolated lodge, dripping wet and trembling from the relentless desert storm, she was met with silence. The small cabin seemed impossibly quiet, as though it were holding its breath, waiting to decide whether this intrusion would be allowed. Tahu, the Apache warrior who had lived alone for years, stood in the shadows, watching her. He was a man molded by solitude, loss, and the unforgiving wilderness. His home was his sanctuary, a place where no one's presence could disturb the fragile balance he had built after the tragedies of his past. Yet Mara's sudden appearance stirred something long dormant within him, a flicker of compassion, curiosity, and cautious interest. As Mara tried to shake the water from her coat and hair, Tahu stepped forward silently, offering her a dry blanket. His movements were careful and deliberate, almost hesitant, as though he feared that any sudden gesture might scare her or, worse, reveal the raw edges of his own loneliness. When he handed her the blanket, their fingers brushed briefly, and Mara sensed a strange warmth emanating from the stoic warrior. Tahu, on the other hand, felt a jolt he hadn't experienced in years. It was not desire or infatuation. It was something older and more fragile, a recognition of human connection, so rare in his life now that he could barely name it. Tahu did not speak much, and that was partly intentional. Words had lost their meaning for him over the years. His wife and child had been taken by disease long ago, leaving behind a void that no conversation could ever fill. He had learned to live with silence, to communicate through actions rather than words, and to avoid the vulnerability that came with speaking to another human being. Mara, in her desperate state, did not judge him for this silence. Instead, she observed it carefully, trying to read the subtle cues in his body language, the stiff way he stood, the guarded glance, the fleeting moments when his eyes softened before he looked away. There was a story behind every movement, a life that had been marked by loss and resilience, and Mara found herself drawn to the mystery of it. Dinner was prepared in silence. Tahu moved around the cabin with the ease and precision of a man accustomed to surviving on his own. He placed a small plate of food before her, then sat at a distance, respecting an unspoken boundary. Mara watched him, feeling the tension and restraint in his every gesture. Here was a man who could protect her with his strength, who could provide shelter and warmth, but who had forgotten the language of intimacy, of trust, of spoken comfort. She realized that her own grief, the fear and exhaustion she carried from fleeing the bandits, was mirrored in his silence. Both of them were survivors of a world that had taken much from them, and now, in this moment, their lives intersected in fragile harmony. Mara thanked him quietly, her voice gentle, trying to bridge the distance between them. Tahu's response was a simple nod, but it carried weight. Every word he had spoken in years could not compare to the meaning conveyed in that one nod. In the firelight, Mara saw the flicker of vulnerability in his eyes, a crack in the armor he had built around himself. She understood instinctively that Tahu's silence was not coldness, it was caution, self-protection, and perhaps fear of getting hurt again. For a moment, she felt empathy for him, even as she acknowledged her own fear and uncertainty. Throughout the evening, Mara and Tahu communicated in small gestures, the passing of the blanket, the careful placement of utensils, the occasional glance. Each action was a word, each silence a sentence. Mara realized that although Tahu had forgotten how to speak to a woman in ordinary terms, he had not forgotten how to care. He had not forgotten how to provide, how to protect, and how to offer a quiet, steadfast presence in a chaotic world. For her, that was enough, more than enough. She began to relax, letting her guard drop just slightly. Aware that she was safe in the hands of this man who seemed incapable of unnecessary words, but who had mastered the language of actions. By the time the fire had burned down to glowing embers, Mara felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in months. She was weary, bruised, and lonely, yet Tahu's silent companionship offered a new kind of comfort. It was a beginning, a subtle, almost imperceptible bridge between two isolated souls. In the quiet of the cabin, with the storm raging outside, a warrior who had forgotten how to speak to a woman and a widow carrying her own pain found the tentative start of trust, understanding, and perhaps the possibility of something more. The storm outside the cabin continued to rage, the wind howling across the desert plains and rattling the wooden walls. Mara sat by the fire, the blanket Tahu had offered wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Despite the warmth, a shiver ran down her spine, not entirely from the cold, but from the memories she could not escape. Her husband had been killed 2 winters ago by a gang of ruthless outlaws, and since that day, her life had been a relentless sequence of survival, fear, and isolation. She had left behind the remnants of her past home and family, seeking refuge wherever the desert and circumstance would allow. And now she had arrived at this cabin, at the door of a man who had been living in solitude long enough to make silence his closest companion. Thu observed her quietly. He had never seen a woman with so much pain etched into her features, and yet there was a strange resilience about her, an inner strength, that refused to break even under the weight of unimaginable loss. He had spent years avoiding human contact, believing that attachments only led to suffering. But Mara's presence stirred something within him he had long tried to suppress: empathy, protectiveness, and a subtle, growing curiosity about the woman who dared to enter his life uninvited. He watched as she pressed her palms against her cheeks, attempting to regain composure, and he felt a pull in his chest that was equal parts alarm and fascination. Finally, Mara spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, carrying the sorrow of countless sleepless nights. She told him about her husband, how he had been murdered in cold blood, and how the men chasing her tonight were none other than the same outlaws responsible for his death. Each word seemed to weigh on her, yet she spoke with deliberate clarity, forcing herself to relive the pain she had carried silently for months. Tahu's jaw tightened as he listened. He felt the tension in his hands and the sudden, protective surge in his heart. He could not allow anyone to harm her, and though he had kept his own emotions in check for so long, he found himself responding instinctively to her vulnerability. Mara's grief was raw and palpable, her shoulders trembling as she tried to contain the torrent of memories that threatened to spill over. She admitted that she had become accustomed to carrying her burdens alone, that she had learned to survive on sheer willpower and instinct. There was a haunting sadness in her eyes, a longing for safety and comfort that she had not allowed herself to feel in years. Tahu recognized the same weight in her that he carried in his own soul, the unspoken sorrow of loss, the isolation of life's cruelties, and the desperate need for someone who could understand without judgment. He approached her cautiously, sitting a few feet away, careful not to invade her space. The firelight illuminated the lines of exhaustion on her face, and Tahu realized that her strength was both remarkable and fragile. Mara had become a survivor in the harshest sense, yet her body and spirit still yearned for a moment of respite, for someone to acknowledge her pain and offer protection without words. Tahu did not speak. Instead, he simply handed her a cup of warm tea he had prepared earlier, letting the steam rise between them. It was a small gesture, but in that moment, it carried more meaning than 1,000 words could convey. As Mara sipped the tea, her hands trembling slightly, Tahu felt an unfamiliar sense of responsibility. He could see how much she had suffered, how much she had endured, and he knew instinctively that she would not ask for help again. And yet, he wanted to offer it. He wanted to shield her from further harm, to provide warmth and safety even if it meant breaking the barriers he had spent a lifetime constructing. It was a dangerous, confusing emotion for a man who had long believed that solitude was the only way to survive. Mara, for her part, began to sense the silent strength in Tahu. She noticed the deliberate care in his actions, the way he seemed to anticipate her needs without being intrusive. Despite her pain, she felt a flicker of trust and a rare sense of relief. Here was a man who understood the weight of loss, who did not rush her grief or attempt to erase it with empty words. And in that understanding, she felt a cautious hope and acknowledgement that perhaps she did not have to bear her burdens entirely alone. As the storm continued its furious assault outside, inside the cabin, a fragile connection was forming. Two wounded souls, each carrying heartache and resilience in equal measure, had found a temporary haven in one another. In the silence punctuated by the crackling fire, Mara and Tahu were beginning a conversation beyond words, a dialogue of presence, understanding, and unspoken promises. The storm outside had not yet relented, but inside Tahu's cabin, the fire burned steadily, casting flickering shadows against the walls. Mara sat closer to the hearth now, the warmth seeping through her damp clothes, easing the tension in her muscles. She had been quiet for some time, absorbing the strange duality of the warrior before her, his presence both forbidding and comforting. Tahu moved around the cabin with a careful deliberation, tending to the fire, adjusting blankets, and performing tasks with the precision of someone who had long lived alone. Every action, though routine, carried with it a silent rhythm, a form of communication in place of words. Mara watched him closely, noticing the way his shoulders relaxed only when he believed she wasn't looking, the subtle tremor in his fingers as he moved objects near her, and the faint tension in his jaw that never seemed to fully ease. As the wind rattled the wooden walls, Mara shivered again. Tahu, noticing her discomfort, quietly retrieved a thick woolen blanket from a chest and held it out to her. She hesitated for a moment, then stepped closer, allowing him to drape it around her shoulders. Their fingers brushed as she adjusted it, and the brief contact sent a shiver of a different kind through both of them. Mara's pulse quickened, and she felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Tahu's heart reacted similarly, a surge of unfamiliar emotions flooding his chest: curiosity, caution, desire, and a protectiveness so instinctive it left him momentarily breathless. They settled near the fire, close enough that the heat mingled between them, but far enough apart to maintain the fragile boundaries each had erected over years of pain and solitude. The flickering light played across Mara's face, highlighting the exhaustion in her eyes, the fine lines of worry etched into her skin, and the softness in her expression that she rarely allowed herself to reveal. Tahu, who had lived in the harsh realities of the wilderness and the cruelty of loss, had forgotten what it meant to witness vulnerability in another human being without fear or judgment. And now, confronted with Mara's raw yet composed presence, he felt something stir inside him that he had not experienced in years, a longing, subtle but insistent, to bridge the space between them. For a long while they remained silent, listening instead to the storm and to the faint crackle of the fire. The quiet was not uncomfortable. It was intimate, a shared solitude that allowed them to exist in the same space without pretense. Mara's gaze occasionally met Tahu's, and when it did, she saw a flicker of tension, a hint of emotion he could not fully conceal. She realized then that he was not merely a stoic protector. He was a man who had been carefully guarding his heart for years, and her presence threatened to unravel the carefully constructed walls. She felt a mixture of awe and compassion for him, understanding instinctively the depth of his restraint and the tenderness that lay just beneath the surface. When a particularly sharp gust rattled the windows, Mara's teeth chattered, and Tahu moved without hesitation, adjusting the blanket around her shoulders and drawing it tighter. She leaned slightly toward him, almost instinctively, and their knees brushed. Neither moved away, and the small contact sent an electric tension through the room. The moment stretched, suspended between the firelight and the shadows, charged with an intimacy neither of them had anticipated but could no longer ignore. Mara's heart raced, her body tense with anticipation. Yet she felt an unexpected sense of safety, a comfort in Tahu's quiet presence that allowed her to release a fraction of her long-held guard. Tahu, aware of the growing tension, struggled with the unfamiliar emotions swirling inside him. He wanted to speak, to bridge the distance between them with words, but the language of vulnerability had long abandoned him. Instead, he allowed his gaze to linger on her face, searching for a sign of consent, of openness, while maintaining the careful respect that had become his instinct. Mara, understanding this silent negotiation, let her eyes soften, her body relax, and allowed herself to feel something she had not in years, the possibility of connection, of being seen, and perhaps even of being desired in a way that was safe and respectful. In that fire-lit room, with the storm raging outside and the quiet intimacy between them, a delicate, unspoken bond began to form. It was a moment of recognition, of two wounded souls acknowledging each other's presence, fragility, and unspoken needs. The warmth of the fire was mirrored by the warmth growing between them, a subtle and powerful reminder that even in the harshest of landscapes, hearts could find resonance if only they were willing to notice. The fire crackled low in the hearth, its flickering light casting long shadows across the cabin walls. Outside, the desert storm had eased slightly, but the wind still whispered through the cracks, a constant reminder of the world beyond. Mara sat wrapped in the thick blanket Tahu had given her, her eyes reflecting the firelight and her thoughts a chaotic swirl of exhaustion, fear, and longing. She had survived countless trials in the harsh desert, yet tonight felt different. She was no longer running alone. She was no longer merely a widow fleeing danger. She was in the presence of someone who seemed to understand the fragility of her heart without her having to explain a single word. Tahu sat across from her, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the fire, his expression unreadable yet intensely attentive. He had not spoken much since her arrival, but every movement, every glance, every careful adjustment of blankets or firewood communicated something deeper than words could capture. Mara felt the weight of his presence, the protective energy radiating from him, and a strange, electrifying tension began to build. It was as though the space between them had become charged, and with every heartbeat, that charge grew stronger. For a moment, Mara allowed herself to simply exist in that space, letting the warmth of the fire and the quiet solidity of Tahu's presence seep into her bones. But the longer she sat there, the more she realized something profound. She did not want to be saved tonight. Not in the conventional sense of protection or rescue, though she would not refuse that if danger came. She meant something more subtle, more intimate. She did not want to hide behind walls or shield herself from the raw, human connection she was beginning to feel with Tahu. She wanted to surrender, just for this night, to the safety, warmth, and closeness of someone who could hold her without judgment, without force, without the expectation of immediate answers. Her voice trembled when she spoke, barely above a whisper, and yet it carried a weight that stopped Tahu mid-motion. "I don't want to be saved tonight," she admitted, her words a confession and a plea all at once. Her eyes searched his, seeking understanding, hoping he would hear the longing, the vulnerability, and the subtle invitation wrapped up in the statement. "I've spent so long protecting myself, running from pain, from loss, from everyone who might care. But not tonight. Tonight I just want to be here, with you. Let me feel without hiding." Tahu froze. Her words struck him like a sudden gust of wind against the stillness he had cultivated for years. He had expected fear, gratitude, perhaps even silent acceptance of his protection, but this was different. This was a request not for safety from the outside world, but for permission to let herself be seen and held within the walls of his cabin. It was intimate in a way that startled him. A challenge and a gift rolled into one. He felt the tension in his chest, the rapid heartbeat beneath his stoic exterior, and the conflicting emotions surged: desire, caution, honor, and the faint echo of long-suppressed longing. For the first time in years, Tahu found words difficult. He wanted to speak, to warn, to remind her of the dangers that still lurked outside. But he also understood that this night was not about danger, it was about connection. Slowly, deliberately, he moved closer, keeping his movements unthreatening, careful to maintain a respect that would allow her to feel safe. Mara did not recoil. Instead, she leaned slightly forward, her eyes soft, her body relaxed despite the lingering tension. The proximity was electric, each inch closing a gap that had been empty for far too long. Tahu lowered his voice to a gentle murmur, almost a whisper, answering not with words of admonition but with acknowledgement. "Then I will not save you," he said, his tone steady but infused with meaning. "Tonight I will only be here with you. Nothing more, nothing less, just presence. You are safe, and I will not take that from you." Mara felt her chest unclench, the weight of constant vigilance slipping just enough for a fragile hope to take root. She realized that this was more than protection, it was respect, understanding, and the quiet power of being allowed to exist without pretense. She could breathe here, she could feel. And for a woman who had carried grief, fear, and solitude for so long, that was nothing short of liberation. In the firelight, with the storm outside softened to a murmur, two souls, one guarded and one wounded, stood at the edge of a new intimacy, a shared understanding that transcended words. That night, Mara would not be saved from danger. She would be saved from loneliness. And in the quiet exchange of trust and acknowledgement, the first spark of something deeper ignited, a promise of connection neither had dared to seek before. The fire had dwindled to glowing embers, bathing the cabin in a soft golden light. The storm outside had softened to a gentle wind, rattling the cabin walls only occasionally, but inside, the air between Mara and Tahu was charged with a quiet intensity. Mara's confession that she did not want to be saved tonight had shifted the dynamic between them. The unspoken rules of distance and solitude were being rewritten by mutual desire, trust, and the courage to allow themselves to feel. Tahu remained seated across from her, broad shoulders tense but his posture careful, deliberate. He was acutely aware of the fragile balance between respect and intimacy. Years of solitude had taught him the dangers of vulnerability. To let someone close to risk attachment was to invite pain. Yet Mara's presence stirred a protective instinct that he could not deny, coupled with an unfamiliar yearning that left him restless. He wanted to reach for her, to hold her, to bridge the physical distance between them, but he resisted. His restraint was born not from coldness, but from understanding the delicate trust Mara had offered him, the courage she had displayed in speaking her truth. Mara, for her part, was no stranger to courage. Life had forced her to face danger, loss, and fear repeatedly, yet in this quiet moment, the courage she summoned was of a different kind, emotional bravery. She had allowed herself to speak, too, express vulnerability, to trust a man who had been a stranger just hours ago. And now she faced the silent test of Tahu's restraint, feeling the pull of desire tempered by his honor. Each glance, each careful gesture he made, was a subtle invitation and a challenge. She understood that his restraint was not indifference, but a measure of respect, and that knowledge emboldened her further. Slowly Mara reached out, bridging the small gap between them. Her fingers brushed against his hand, tentative at first, testing boundaries. Tahu did not pull away. He let her hand rest in his, feeling the warmth of her skin against his own. It was a quiet, deliberate contact, a dialogue of touch that spoke more than words ever could. Mara's heartbeat quickened, a mixture of anticipation, fear, and excitement, but she did not retract. Instead, she let herself feel the connection, trusting him to meet her courage with his own restraint. Tahu's breath hitched slightly at her touch, but he remained composed, aware that any sudden movement could break the fragile trust between them. He looked into her eyes, searching for affirmation, for consent, and found it reflected there. A softness, a willingness, a desire to let herself be held without pressure or expectation. Slowly, deliberately, he allowed his hand to cover hers completely, palm to palm, fingers curling lightly around hers. The simple act carried profound meaning. It was acknowledgement, acceptance, and a silent promise that her courage would be met with his care. The firelight danced across their faces, highlighting the tension and intimacy of the moment. Mara felt a warmth spreading through her chest, not just from the fire or physical proximity, but from the knowledge that she was being seen, understood, and respected. Tahu, in turn, felt an awakening he had not expected, an awareness that his heart, long guarded and hardened by loss, could respond to someone who had chosen to trust him. The restraint he exercised was not a denial of desire, but a careful honoring of her boundaries, a conscious decision to let intimacy grow organically rather than force it through impatience or need. Words were unnecessary. The cabin, the fire, the remnants of the storm, and the quiet touch of their hands created a space where vulnerability and courage could coexist. Mara's courage gave him permission to feel without fear of misstep, and Tahu's restraint reassured her that her vulnerability was safe. It was a delicate dance, a silent conversation of heartbeats, glances, and breaths, where each acknowledged the other's strength and fragility. As the night deepened, Mara leaned slightly closer, her head tilting toward him in a gesture of trust and invitation. Tahu's hand tightened gently over hers, a measured response that conveyed both protection and consent. In that moment, they were no longer merely a wounded widow and a solitary warrior. They were two human beings discovering the possibility of connection, the courage to let down defenses, and the strength to honor one another's boundaries while allowing intimacy to flourish. By the time the embers glowed low, the unspoken truth was clear. Mara's courage had met Tahu's restraint, and in that meeting, a bond had formed. One was willing to risk emotional exposure, and the other was willing to honor it with unwavering care. In the quiet of the cabin, amidst the softened whispers of the wind outside, two hearts, one guarded, one brave, were beginning to synchronize, slowly, deliberately, and beautifully. By the time the night deepened, the storm outside had fully subsided, leaving only the gentle whisper of wind brushing against the cabin walls. Inside, the fire had burned down to soft embers, casting a golden glow over the small space and bathing Mara and Tahu in a warmth that had little to do with flames. The hours had passed in a slow rhythm of shared silence, tentative gestures, and quiet acknowledgement of each other's presence. For Mara, the weariness of months of grief and flight had melted slightly. For Tahu, the years of solitude and suppressed longing were beginning to crack, revealing a depth of feeling he had long denied. The moment they had shared earlier, the careful brushing of hands, the acknowledgement of her courage and his restraint, had opened a door neither of them expected. Mara, sitting close to the embers, allowed herself to lean subtly toward him, her head brushing just near his shoulder. The gesture was soft, tentative, but it spoke volumes. Tahu, feeling the nearness of her warmth, allowed himself to respond without hesitation. He placed his hand gently over hers again, letting their fingers intertwine with a deliberate tenderness. The contact was electrifying, yet safe, a combination of desire tempered with respect. Neither rushed, neither forced the moment, but both understood the significance of this silent intimacy. In that quiet, suspended time, Mara began to speak softly, her voice barely above a whisper, sharing fragments of her memories and feelings that she had never voiced before. She told him of the nights spent crying alone, the moments of fear when bandits threatened her, the endless loneliness that had become her constant companion. Tahu listened, his heart swelling with protectiveness and empathy. Every word she spoke seemed to reach deep into him, stirring emotions he had long kept buried. He realized that the connection forming between them was not born merely of attraction, but of shared vulnerability, a recognition of pain, resilience, and the human need for understanding. As she spoke, Tahu felt an urge to comfort her that went beyond words. Slowly, carefully, he drew her closer, his arm wrapping around her shoulders in a gesture of protection and support. Mara leaned into him, allowing herself to feel the strength of his presence, the steady warmth of his body, and the undeniable sense of safety that came from being held by someone who truly understood her fears. The physical closeness mirrored the emotional intimacy that had been growing since she arrived, a quiet, sacred acknowledgement of trust and acceptance. The night unfolded in a rhythm of mutual care. Tahu adjusted the blanket around them both, shielding her from the residual chill, and Mara rested her head against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. In that moment, they existed outside of time and danger, outside of the harsh realities of the world beyond the cabin walls. There was no fear, no past to haunt them, only the shared presence of two souls learning to be close without expectation, learning to trust in a bond that was delicate yet undeniable. For Mara, it was a night of awakening. She had carried the weight of loss, fear, and solitude for too long, but in Tahu's presence, she discovered something she thought impossible, the ability to be seen, cared for, and even desired without threat or judgment. She allowed herself to feel hope, warmth, and longing, the kind of human connection she had been starving for since her husband's death. Each gentle touch, each wordless acknowledgement was a balm to her weary spirit, healing wounds she had believed permanent. For Tahu, the experience was equally transformative. He had long believed that opening his heart would only bring pain, yet Mara's courage and trust showed him otherwise. In her vulnerability, he found not weakness but strength, not dependence but partnership. Holding her close, feeling her lean into him, he realized that intimacy did not have to be destructive, that closeness could bring renewal, and that the heart he had kept guarded for years could still beat in harmony with another. By the first light of dawn, the two of them remained entwined, the fire reduced to ashes, the cabin silent except for the occasional sigh of wind through the trees. Mara's eyes opened, meeting Tahu's gaze with a quiet acknowledgement of what had transpired. Neither needed words, the night itself had spoken volumes. They had shared something profound, a connection that went beyond fear, beyond grief, and beyond the loneliness that had defined their lives. That night changed both of them. Mara, for the first time in months, felt safe and alive. Tahu, for the first time in years, felt needed and capable of care again. The storm outside had passed, but the storm within, the emotional turbulence of pain, fear, and isolation had also begun to settle, leaving a calm, tender understanding in its wake. It was a beginning, the start of trust, intimacy, and a bond neither of them had expected. Yet both had needed more than they had realized. Morning arrived softly, spilling golden light through the gaps in the cabin walls and onto the worn wooden floor. The storm had fully passed, leaving the desert calm, serene, and deceptively quiet. Outside, the world seemed renewed, but within the cabin, a tension lingered. Mara stirred in her sleep, the blanket tangled around her, and Tahu watched her with a mixture of tenderness and unease. The night they had shared had been transformative, binding them in a fragile intimacy that neither had anticipated but both cherished. Yet dawn brought the return of reality, the inevitable confrontation with the dangers Mara had fled, and the choice they would have to face together. Subtle sound of hooves on the distant dirt road stirred Tahu from his quiet vigil. He rose slowly, eyes narrowing as he scanned the horizon through the open doorway. It did not take long for him to recognize the shapes of the outlaws, riding toward the cabin, the same men who had murdered Mara's husband and chased her through the desert for months. His jaw tightened, and a familiar surge of protective instinct coursed through him. For years he had lived by the code of the warrior, defending his own and striking with precision. This was no different, yet it was different entirely. He could not fight alone tonight, not only because Mara's life was at stake, but because he now felt something far stronger than duty or honor. He felt love, care, and a desire to keep her safe at any cost. Mara awoke fully as Tahu moved to the doorway, his stance rigid, alert, and commanding. She took in the sight of him broad-shouldered, calm, yet undeniably ready for action, and her heart surged with both fear and reassurance. She realized in that instant that she was no longer merely a victim or a fugitive. She was no longer entirely alone. Tahu's presence was a shield, yes, but it was also a promise that she would not face danger unprotected, and that the man who had sheltered her through the night would now stand beside her to face whatever threats remained. The outlaws drew closer, confident and cruel, but unaware that the lone cabin they sought would not be unguarded. Tahu moved with the precision of a seasoned warrior, bow in hand, eyes scanning each rider, calculating each potential move. Mara, standing just behind him, felt a tremor of fear, yet she did not retreat. She had spent months running, hiding, and fearing, but now she found a quiet strength in the bond she shared with Tahu. He had protected her emotionally through the night, and now he would protect her physically, and she would face him in that reckoning, not apart from him. As the outlaws approached, Tahu's voice, calm and commanding, cut through the morning air. "You will not pass," he said, his tone carrying the weight of authority and lethal intent. Mara watched as he positioned himself, unwavering, and felt a swell of gratitude, admiration, and something deeper, an awakening to the reality that she could trust, that she could lean on someone without fear of betrayal. In that moment, she understood the depth of her feelings for Tahu, feelings that had blossomed overnight but now demanded acknowledgement. The confrontation was brief. Tahu's presence alone, combined with the knowledge that he was a man both capable and relentless, was enough to make the outlaws hesitate. Mara saw the fear in their eyes, the realization that this cabin was no longer a simple target. When they finally retreated, defeated by both his skill and their own cowardice, Mara felt a profound sense of relief, but also clarity. She looked at Tahu, still poised, still protective, and realized the truth that had been forming quietly over the past night. She no longer wanted to walk alone. Stepping closer, she reached out and took his hand, the gesture unspoken yet full of meaning. "I didn't come here to be saved," she said softly, her eyes locking onto his. "I came to be found." Tahu's stern expression softened, a rare smile touching his lips. The bond forged through fire, silence, touch, and courage had matured into something neither of them could ignore. Mara had chosen him, and he had chosen her not for protection alone, but for partnership, for trust, for love that had been hesitant but now undeniable. As the sun climbed higher, warming the desert air, they stood together at the threshold of the cabin. Mara no longer felt fear or isolation. The outlaws were gone, the storm had passed, and a future that had seemed impossible just hours before now lay ahead, defined by a choice both of them had made, to walk forward together. Tahu, the lonely warrior who had lived in silence, and Mara, the widow who had carried too much grief, were no longer merely survivors. They were a pair bound by shared courage, trust, and the unspoken promise that whatever the future held, they would face it side by side.